Let me paint a picture for you that captures a moment frozen in time, somewhere in the French countryside during one of history's most devastating conflicts. Imagine yourself standing on a ridge overlooking the gently undulating terrain of the Lorraine region, where centuries of farming have shaped the landscape into a patchwork of fields and forests. But in mid-September 1944, this pastoral scene bears the unmistakable scars of modern mechanized warfare. The ground is torn and cratered from artillery bombardment. The hedgerows are shattered, and the acrid smell of burning fuel and gunpowder hangs in the autumn air like an invisible shroud. Somewhere down in that valley, threading its way through terrain that has already consumed hundreds of American fighting vehicles, moves a single medium tank bearing the name in the mood painted on its turret. The crew inside this 30-ton steel box has developed something approaching absolute faith in their commander. A staff sergeant from rural Texas, whose name has become synonymous with destruction among both American troops and their German adversaries. His name is Lafayette Green Pool, and what he has accomplished over the preceding 11 weeks defies statistical probability and conventional military wisdom alike. On this particular September day, his remarkable streak of combat survival and enemy destruction is about to reach its violent conclusion, though the man himself does not yet know this. The narrative surrounding Lafayette Pool extends far beyond the simple accounting of enemy equipment destroyed, though those numbers are themselves staggering enough to demand attention. What makes his story genuinely compelling is the way it illuminates fundamental questions about human excellence under extreme pressure, about the cold mathematical calculations that military leadership requires, and about the profound psychological consequences that exceptional martial skill can impose on those who possess it. His experience forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable questions regarding what qualities we choose to valorize in combat soldiers, and whether demonstrating extraordinary proficiency at the application of lethal force should define someone's identity or determine their value. To properly appreciate why Pool's combat record matters and why the controversial decision to permanently remove him from frontline service continues to provoke debate among scholars of military history, we must trace the full arc of his journey from its humble beginnings through the complex tapestry of circumstances that produced the most effective tank commander the United States has ever fielded. The hardscrabble existence of Depression, Texas was not an environment that anyone would have predicted would forge military legends. The economic catastrophe that gripped America during the 1930s devastated agricultural communities with particular ferocity in young people coming of age in small towns like Odem, where Pool entered the world in 1919, absorbed certain fundamental truths about survival through direct experience rather than formal instruction. They learned that making it through difficult times required practical knowledge, tireless effort, and creative resourcefulness when proper tools and materials were unavailable. Pool's formative years unfolded on working farms and ranches where expensive machinery represented enormous capital investments that families could not afford to replace when things broke down. Repairs had to be accomplished on location using whatever components could be salvaged, improvised, or jerry-rigged into functionality. This demanding environment cultivated something that would prove extraordinarily valuable when Pool eventually found himself commanding armor in combat: a bone-deep comprehension of mechanical systems, an intuitive grasp of how they could malfunction, and the confidence to push equipment past its designed operational parameters when survival demanded nothing less. Pool developed the ability to disassemble complex engines and reassemble them, to diagnose mechanical problems purely through sound, and to sense almost instinctively what machines could endure under stress. These capabilities were not acquired through reading technical manuals or completing formal educational programs. They emerged organically from countless hours spent keeping decrepit farm equipment operational when his family's economic survival hung in the balance. When Pool walked into an Army recruiting office in 1941, just months before Japanese aircraft transformed Pearl Harbor into a smoking ruin and catapulted America into global conflict, nothing in his initial evaluations marked him as destined for greatness. His scores on military aptitude assessments fell within normal ranges, and his early training reviews noted competence without suggesting exceptional potential. The evaluators observed that he maintained good physical condition, demonstrated mechanical inclination, and exhibited a notably steady temperament under stress. But these observations warranted no special emphasis in their reports. The Army's personnel system directed him toward armored vehicle training, which during that period meant becoming proficient with the M3 Stuart series light tanks and their various configurations. Poole adapted to armored warfare with natural ease. The cramped interior spaces that caused many soldiers psychological distress did not trouble him. The overwhelming sensory chaos of simulated combat, with its deafening noise, choking smoke, and constant violent motion, failed to disturb his fundamental composure. More significantly, his instructors noticed that Poole demonstrated an unusual capacity to maintain accurate mental awareness of battlefield conditions even when sealed inside his vehicle with visibility reduced to narrow observation slits and periscope views. He appeared to construct and continuously update an internal representation of the tactical situation that remained reliable even when direct observation became impossible. This remarkable spatial cognition, combined with his mechanical intuition, established him as a capable tank operator from his earliest training days. Being a capable operator and becoming a combat commander of legendary effectiveness represent entirely distinct achievements. The metamorphosis from competent soldier to tactical virtuoso would occur only under the crucible of actual combat. The American armored formations Poole joined were experiencing rapid transformation during the early war years, with organizational structures and tactical doctrines undergoing continuous revision as military theorists struggled to understand the implications of mechanized warfare. American thinking about how tanks should be employed remained unsettled and frequently contradictory throughout this period. One school of thought advocated using armored vehicles primarily as mobile support for infantry operations, essentially treating tanks as rolling strongpoints that could help foot soldiers advance against prepared defensive positions. Another faction, deeply influenced by the spectacular German armored victories in Poland and France, championed massed tank formations capable of conducting independent operations and executing deep penetration, maneuvers that could collapse entire enemy defensive systems. Poole's assigned unit, the 3rd Armored Division, would eventually find itself employed in ways that reflected both doctrinal approaches, sometimes shifting between concepts within a single operational sequence. This institutional confusion regarding armored warfare philosophy had concrete implications for how tank crews received training and how they conceptualized their role in combat. Poole, however, appeared to operate according to principles he synthesized independently, principles that incorporated elements from competing doctrinal schools while being constrained by neither. The fighting vehicle that would become inseparable from Poole's combat identity was the M4 Sherman medium tank, a machine that has generated more passionate disagreement among military historians than perhaps any other weapons system fielded during the Second World War. Appreciating Poole's accomplishments and recognizing what made them so extraordinary requires understanding both the capabilities and the serious limitations of the platform he used to achieve them. The Sherman emerged from American industrial philosophy and strategic planning as a deliberate set of engineering compromises. Its designers prioritized mass production capability, operational reliability across extended distances with minimal maintenance requirements, and mechanical simplicity that would allow hastily trained crews to operate it competently. Measured against these specific criteria, the Sherman achieved remarkable success. American factories manufactured approximately 50,000 Sherman variants during the conflict, dwarfing production totals for any competing tank design. The vehicle could travel hundreds of miles under its own power without major breakdown, required relatively few specialized tools for routine maintenance, and crews could achieve basic operational proficiency within weeks rather than the months required. For more complex designs, the difficulty was that these design priorities extracted significant costs in direct combat performance. Sherman armor thickness was modest compared to the protection provided by contemporary German medium and heavy tanks. The standard 75mm main gun frequently proved inadequate for penetrating the frontal armor arrays of Panthers and Tigers at normal combat ranges. Perhaps most troublingly, the Sherman's gasoline power plant displayed an alarming tendency to ignite when the vehicle suffered penetrating hits, earning the tank grim nicknames from soldiers on both sides. German troops called the Sherman the Tommy Gucker, a macabre reference to how frequently American tankers perished in flames inside their vehicles. American crews developed their own gallows humor about their equipment, sometimes referring to their tanks as Ronsons, after a popular cigarette lighter brand whose advertising proclaimed that the product lights every time. The statistical realities were devastating for Sherman crews to contemplate. A Sherman matching itself against a Panther or Tiger in direct frontal engagement faced near-certain destruction. Analysis conducted both during and after the war suggested that destroying a single Tiger typically required engaging it with 5 Sherman tanks, with 4 of those Shermans being knocked out during the process. Standard tactical guidance issued to Sherman commanders emphasized avoiding frontal confrontations whenever possible, maneuvering to achieve flank or rear shots where German armor offered less protection, and leveraging numerical superiority to overwhelm individual German vehicles. This advice was tactically sound when viewed from an aggregate planning perspective, but it provided limited reassurance to individual crews who had to execute such maneuvers while enemy gunners trained weapons capable of annihilating them with a single well-placed round. Poole's response to this tactical problem was thoroughly unconventional and appeared, by any standard measure of rational risk assessment, essentially suicidal. Rather than attempting to avoid contact with German armor formations, he actively sought engagement opportunities. Rather than approaching enemy positions with measured caution while searching for positional advantage, he attacked with explosive aggression, closing engagement distances before German gunners could properly acquire and track his rapidly moving vehicle. Rather than waiting to achieve numerical superiority before committing to action, he frequently engaged German forces with only his single tank and a small number of supporting vehicles. Evaluated against standard doctrinal guidelines and statistical probability distributions, Poole should have died within his first weeks of combat. The fact that he survived and accumulated the highest verified kill total of any American tank commander in recorded history demands careful examination. Part of the explanation lies in Poole's exceptional skills as a gunner and fire control director. Armored combat during the 1940s bore little resemblance to the precision engagement capabilities that would characterize later generations of fighting vehicles equipped with computerized fire control solutions and stabilized weapon mounts. Striking a moving target while one S-on vehicle bounced and lurched across rough terrain demanded intuitive mastery of ballistic the ability to estimate range and calculate lead distances almost instantaneously, and mechanical dexterity sufficient to manipulate gun controls with surgical precision under extremely challenging conditions. Poole possessed all these abilities, developed to extraordinary levels. His loader, Wilbert Richards, would later describe how Poole could identify threatening targets, process the fire control solution, and issue engagement commands almost before other crew members registered what they were shooting at. Even more remarkably, Poole maintained this accuracy while his tank moved at maximum speed across broken ground, a capability that most experienced tankers considered functionally impossible. Conventional practice called for brief halts to allow aimed shots, accepting the vulnerability of temporary immobility as an acceptable trade-off for accuracy. Poole refused to adopt this approach, keeping his vehicle in constant motion while somehow still placing rounds precisely where they needed to go. Yet gunnery excellence alone cannot fully account for Poole's survival through conditions that killed most of his contemporaries. Numerous skilled gunners perished during their first combat engagements, their technical proficiency insufficient to overcome the basic physical disadvantages Sherman crews faced when confronting German armor directly. Poole's continued existence depended on something additional, what observers could only describe as an almost supernatural ability to interpret terrain features and anticipate enemy behavior. His crew members recalled how Poole would survey an unfamiliar stretch of ground and immediately indicate positions where German anti-tank weapons were most probably emplaced, routes that offered optimal concealment for approach movement, and locations from which he could engage enemy forces with maximum tactical advantage. This was not something Poole could explain systematically or translate into teachable methodology. When pressed about how he determined where German defenders would position themselves, Poole offered responses like, "It just appears right," or "That's the spot I would select." This instinctive tactical perception, combined with his aggressive operational philosophy and superior gunnery, produced a combat approach that proved devastatingly effective but essentially impossible to replicate. Conventional instruction could not transmit what Poole accomplished. His techniques succeeded because they represented manifestations of his particular constellation of skills, instincts, and psychological makeup. Other tankers who attempted to emulate his aggressive methods without possessing his underlying abilities typically died rapidly. The Allied invasion of Normandy during June 1944 initiated Poole's extraordinary combat sequence. His Sherman, christened in the mood and homage to the beloved Glenn Miller composition, descended a landing craft ramp onto Utah Beach and promptly began engaging German forces defending the invasion perimeter. Within hours of touching French soil, Poole had destroyed his first 2 enemy tanks, a pair of Panzer IV medium tanks that had been interdicting American infantry, attempting to push inland from the beaches. This initial engagement established the template for everything that followed. Poole detected the German vehicles before their crews became aware of his presence, executed rapid maneuver to achieve a flanking position, and destroyed both targets with a small number of precisely aimed rounds. The complete action consumed less than 2 minutes. The German tank crews never discharged a single round in Poole's direction. Throughout the following days and weeks, as American forces struggled against fierce German resistance to break free from the confined Normandy beach, Poole's destruction tally climbed at rates that initially seemed implausible to his superior officers. 5 enemy vehicles in a single engagement, 8 destroyed in another, a dozen eliminated during one afternoon's sustained combat. His after-action reports initially generated skepticism at higher headquarters until independent witnesses verified the wreckage trails Poole had left across the battlefield. June. Poole had already destroyed more German military equipment than most tank commanders would engage throughout their entire combat careers. By the close of July, he had achieved legendary status within the 3rd Armored Division, a figure whose mere presence seemed to guarantee favorable outcomes in any tactical situation. The combat operations during July that elevated Poole to legendary standing occurred during the struggle for Saint-Lay, a strategically vital road junction the Germans defended with exceptional determination. American offensive progress had stalled against elaborate defensive networks, exploiting the famous Norman hedgerow terrain, and tank casualties were accumulating at alarming rates. Poole's platoon received orders to support an infantry assault against a particularly obscure German defensive position that had already repulsed to previous American attacks. Poole approached this tactical problem in his characteristic manner, driving his tank forward at maximum velocity while German anti-tank gunners were still attempting to establish firing solutions. His gunner, Corporal Willis Aular, subsequently characterized the resulting engagement as absolute chaos from inside the Sherman, with Poole shouting fire commands while simultaneously conducting evasive maneuvers through concentrated incoming fire. In approximately 15 minutes, Poole had destroyed 4 German anti-tank gun positions and 3 Panzer IV tanks that had been providing mobile support to the defensive system. The infantry assault that followed the armor action encountered only token resistance. When Poole's superiors examined the battlefield afterward, they discovered 7 burning German vehicles and the shattered remains of 3 anti-tank gun emplacements, all eliminated by a single American Sherman in what could only be described as a one-sided annihilation. It was during this operational phase that Poole sustained his first significant wound. During a firefight near the town of Mayon, a German round detonated sufficiently close to Poole's tank to propel shrapnel through the turret hatch, striking Poole in the shoulder and upper arm. The injury caused considerable pain, but did not incapacitate him. Poole declined evacuation, permitted a combat medic to apply field dressings, and continued engaging the enemy. He destroyed 2 additional German vehicles before the engagement concluded. When his company commander directed him to rear area facilities for proper medical attention, Poole protested that his wounds were minor and that his crew depended on him. The commander eventually relented, allowing Poole to remain with his unit after receiving more comprehensive treatment from battalion medical personnel. This pattern of refusing evacuation for injuries that would have removed most soldiers from frontline duty would repeat itself over the coming weeks, with consequences that would ultimately determine Poole's future. The breakout from Normandy confinement during late July and early August 1944, designated Operation Cobra, released American armored formations into open terrain for the first time since the initial invasion. For tankers of Poole's aggressive temperament, this represented the operational environment they had trained to exploit. Ground where speed and firepower could be employed offensively without the constraints that hedgerow fighting imposed. Poole's destruction count accelerated dramatically during this phase. His tank appeared to materialize wherever German resistance proved strongest, leaving trails of burning wreckage in its wake. During the pursuit across France, Pool's unit advanced hundreds of miles within weeks, and Pool engaged German forces on nearly a daily basis. His crew developed what approached religious faith in their commander's ability to locate the enemy, destroy them, and return vehicle and crew safely to friendly lines. The Falaise pocket operations during mid-August provided Pool with his single most productive combat day. German formations attempting to withdraw from the developing encirclement were forced to transit a series of road junctions and choke points, and Pool positioned his Sherman at one such intersection where retreating German columns would have to pass within effective engagement range. Throughout an entire afternoon, Pool systematically destroyed every German vehicle that attempted to utilize that road. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, supply trucks, reconnaissance vehicles, and self-propelled artillery all fell victim to his devastating gunnery. When his ammunition supply depleted, Pool's crew would withdraw briefly to replenish from support vehicles, then return to the killing ground. By day's end, Pool had destroyed 17 German vehicles, along with numerous smaller targets. The road became impassable due to burning wreckage, and German units began seeking alternate withdrawal routes to avoid what survivors had begun calling the death trap. During this period, German intelligence organizations began taking specific interest in Pool's distinctive Sherman. Reports arriving from frontline units referenced an American tank-bearing characteristic markings that invariably appeared wherever combat proved most intense, and that demonstrated capabilities far exceeding German expectations for the typically inferior American vehicles. Some German units reportedly began declining to engage when they identified Pool's tank, preferring retreat or surrender to what appeared certain destruction. This developing reputation for invincibility was inevitably somewhat exaggerated through the distortions of combat reporting, but it produced genuine tactical consequences. The psychological impact Pool's presence exerted on German morale approached the significance of the physical destruction he inflicted. Pool's second serious wound occurred during August when a German anti-tank gun achieved a fortunate hit. The round struck Pool's Sherman directly and penetrated the armor before partially detonating within the crew compartment. Pool's leg sustained severe fragment damage, temporarily rendering him unable to walk unassisted. Once again, he refused evacuation beyond immediate medical intervention. His crew assisted him into the turret, where he could exercise command while keeping weight off his injured limb. He continued combat operations for several additional weeks, directing his tank through engagements while experiencing significant pain. This persistent refusal to depart combat, despite accumulating injuries, was simultaneously admirable and concerning too. Pool's chain of command. His skills remained invaluable, but commanders were beginning to question how much longer his remarkable fortune could continue. By early September 1944, Pool had sustained continuous frontline combat operations for over 2 months, a duration that would have been exceptional even for infantry soldiers, let alone tank crews with their dramatically elevated casualty rates. The statistical improbability of his continued survival was apparent to everyone who examined his service record. Tank commanders operating in the European theater had average combat life expectancies measured in weeks. Pool had survived over 2 months of some of the war's most intense armored combat without being killed. He had sustained wounds on 2 occasions, had his tank struck multiple times, and had lost and replaced equipment during several incidents. Yet he kept returning, kept fighting, and kept destroying German equipment at rates that seemed more fictional than factual. The 3rd Armored Division's advance into the Lorraine region during September 1944 introduced Pool to terrain significantly different from what he had previously encountered. The open farmland of central France yielded 2 rolling hills cloaked in dense woodland, terrain that heavily advantaged defensive operations. German anti-tank weapons could be concealed within tree lines with mutually supporting fields of fire, while attacking armor had to cross open ground under observation from multiple directions simultaneously. The tactical advantages Pool had exploited so successfully during the pursuit across France were substantially neutralized in this environment. Armored combat in Lorraine devolved into an attritional sequence of ambushes and brutal close-range engagements, where neither combatant force could establish clear tactical dominance. September 15, 1944, commenced similarly to numerous other days during the Lorraine campaign. Pool's unit was advancing toward the German frontier as component of 3rd Army S Drive toward the Reich homeland. The The terrain ahead appeared ominous, a stretch of exposed ground bounded by dense woodland that could conceal any number of German defensive positions. Poole studied the landscape through his field glasses, attempting to identify likely ambush locations. He identified several positions where German weapons might be concealed, but could not confirm which were actually occupied. The only method for determining this was to advance and draw enemy fire. Poole's Sherman led the platoon forward, moving at moderate speed, while Poole continuously scanned the tree line for any indication of hostile activity. The German gunners had selected their positions skillfully. When they initiated their ambush, Poole's tanks were caught in crossing fires from multiple directions. Poole immediately began maneuvering to engage, his instincts indicating which position demanded priority attention. He had identified the primary threat and was bringing his main gun to bear when a high-velocity projectile slammed into the side armor of his Sherman. The German gunner had achieved a textbook engagement. The round struck the thinner lateral armor of Poole's tank, penetrated into the crew compartment, and detonated. Poole, who was occupying his customary position with head and shoulders protruding above the turret hatch to maximize his observation capability, was hurled from the vehicle by the explosion. He struck the ground with severe impact, his leg mangled by fragments and shrapnel wounds scattered across his torso. His crew, through remarkable fortune, survived the penetrating hit and managed to evacuate the burning Sherman. They discovered Poole lying unconscious several meters distant, bleeding profusely from multiple wounds. Medical personnel who reached the scene worked urgently to stabilize his condition before loading him into an ambulance for transport to a field hospital. His prognosis remained uncertain. Poole had sustained severe damage, and even if he survived, his days as a combat soldier might have concluded. Poole regained awareness 2 days afterward in a hospital bed located far behind active combat zones. His leg was immobilized in traction apparatus, his torso encased in bandages, and he was receiving blood replacement through transfusion equipment. The medical staff informed him that his survival was fortunate, that his leg had approached the threshold requiring amputation but had been preserved through emergency surgical intervention, and that he faced months of rehabilitation before normal ambulation would be possible. Poole's first coherent utterances concerned not his injuries, but his crew and his unit. He demanded information about whether his men had survived, how the engagement had concluded, and when he could return to frontline duty. The physicians exchanged glances that Poole would subsequently recognize as conveying sympathy. They possessed knowledge he had not yet comprehended. The determination to permanently remove Lafayette Poole from combat originated at the highest echelons of Third Army Command, and while the official rationale emphasized his medical condition, the actual reasoning involved considerably greater complexity. General Patton, the general commanding Third Army, and among the most aggressively minded field commanders in American military history, had personally examined Poole's service record and concluded that Poole would not return to frontline operations, regardless of how thoroughly he recovered from his injuries. This decision appeared contradictory, coming from Patton, a general renowned for driving his units relentlessly and accepting substantial casualties as acceptable costs for maintaining operational momentum. Understanding why Patton reached this conclusion requires examining his philosophy regarding command and his sophisticated comprehension of what factors made military forces effective. Patton's reputation for apparent indifference to casualties, while containing elements of truth, obscures a more nuanced understanding of military effectiveness. Patton recognized that armies are not merely aggregations of interchangeable personnel, but complex organizations whose capabilities depend critically on the experience and skills their members possess. A formation composed entirely of inexperienced replacement troops would perform far below its theoretical capacity, while a unit maintaining a core of combat-experienced veterans could achieve results grossly disproportionate to its numerical strength. Veterans did not simply fight more effectively than newly arrived soldiers. They also transmitted survival knowledge to newer personnel, passed along hard-acquired tactical expertise, and provided leadership that no volume of institutional training could adequately substitute. Patton valued this accumulated organizational knowledge intensely and worked to preserve it through every available mechanism. His aggressive tactical approaches were designed partly to achieve rapid victory, which he believed represented the most effective method for minimizing total casualties, but also because he understood that extended combat ground down the veteran cadre that made units combative. Poole represented an extreme manifestation of accumulated combat expertise. His 81 days of continuous operations had generated knowledge that no training program could replicate. He understood German tactical methods intimately, having confronted them repeatedly under every conceivable circumstance. He knew what Sherman tanks could and could not accomplish in actual combat, not the theoretical capabilities documented in technical publications. He had developed engagement techniques that maximized the Sherman's modest advantages while minimizing its considerable vulnerabilities, and he had achieved all this while preserving his crew through conditions that killed the overwhelming majority of tank crews who encountered them. This knowledge was invaluable, and it resided exclusively within Poole's memory. If Poole died in combat, this knowledge would perish with him. The question confronting Patton was how to extract maximum value from this accumulated expertise. The mathematical reasoning became relatively straightforward once articulated in these terms. Poole, returning to combat operations, might destroy another 50 or perhaps 100 German vehicles before ultimately being killed, a meaningful but not strategically decisive contribution to the overall war effort. Poole, instructing new tank commanders, could transmit his knowledge to hundreds of future combat leaders, each of whom might subsequently train additional personnel. The propagating effect of Poole's expertise, appropriately, could preserve thousands of American lives and meaningfully improve the combat effectiveness of armored formations across the entire military establishment. Evaluated from a purely utilitarian framework, maintaining Poole's survival and employing him as an instructor represented the obviously superior allocation of this human resource. The war's outcome would not be determined by however many additional kills Poole might personally accumulate, but it could be substantially influenced by how many of the tank crews being trained to replace the Army's devastating losses actually survived their initial combat engagements. Poole's accumulating wounds also factored into the decision calculus. He had now sustained serious injuries on 3 separate occasions within less than 3 months of combat operations. The statistical probability of surviving a 4th wounding was not encouraging. Each successive injury had proven more severe than its predecessor, and Poole's consistent refusal to properly recuperate before returning to combat had likely degraded his baseline physical condition. Medical officers reviewing his case observed that his body exhibited stress indicators far exceeding what his chronological age would suggest. The accumulated physiological toll of constant combat, inadequate recovery periods, and incompletely healed injuries. Poole might believe himself capable of returning to frontline duty, but his body was communicating a different assessment. Returning him to active combat would not serve his genuine interests. Patton additionally had to evaluate the morale implications that might follow Poole's potential death. Poole had achieved legendary status within the 3rd Armored Division, a figure whose continued survival represented the possibility that skill and aggressive action could overcome the terrible odds confronting Sherman crews. His death would exert psychological impact far exceeding the loss of an ordinary tank commander. If Poole could be killed, soldiers would inevitably reason, then no one possessed genuine protection. The death of a typical tanker represented tragedy for his crew and family, but the death of someone possessing Poole's stature would cast a shadow across the entire division. Preferable to have Poole withdrawn from combat and instructing at a training installation, alive and transmitting his expertise, than dead on some French hillside with his legend terminated and his knowledge lost. When Poole received notification that he would not return to combat duty, his reaction was precisely what anyone familiar with his personality would have anticipated. He was enraged. He protested through official channels, composing letters to his commanding officers and requesting audiences with anyone who might possess influence over the determination. He argued that his wounds were healing that he remained entirely capable of commanding a tank, that his crew required his presence, and that the war continued. He noted that he had been wounded previously and returned to combat successfully. He insisted the decision was inequitable, that he had earned the right to continue fighting. None of these protests altered the outcome. The decision had been rendered at command levels far beyond what a staff sergeant's objections could reach, and the reasoning underlying it would not be explained to Poole in sufficient detail to help him understand why his superiors had chosen as they had. Poole's eventual assignment was to Fort Knox, Kentucky, the Army's principal armor training installation. His responsibility would involve instructing new tank commanders in armored warfare tactics, drawing upon his combat experience to prepare them for conditions they would encounter in the European theater. Formally, this represented an important and prestigious assignment. In practice, for Poole, it felt like banishment. He had become accustomed to combat's immediacy, to the intense clarity that action provided, and the profound satisfaction of destroying the enemy. Training facilities seemed stagnant and artificial in comparison. The routine of classroom instruction and field exercises could not replicate the life-or-death intensity of actual combat. Poole committed himself to the work because it represented his only available option, but he never ceased wanting to return to the fighting. The training curricula Poole developed at Fort Knox drew directly from his combat experience in ways that standard Army instruction did not, where official doctrine frequently presented idealized scenarios and theoretically optimal solutions. Poole taught the disordered reality of armored combat. He explained how German anti-tank gunners actually conducted themselves, where they positioned their weapons, and how they prioritized targets. He demonstrated engagement techniques that had preserved his life when conventional tactics would have produced his death. He was uncompromisingly honest regarding the Sherman's limitations, explaining to new commanders that their vehicles could not survive direct confrontations with German heavy armor and that their only viable options involved positioning, speed, and controlled aggression. He taught them terrain reading, ambush position identification, and appropriate reactions when shooting commenced. Most critically, he taught them how to preserve their crews, emphasizing that destroying enemy forces meant nothing if it cost them their tank and their personnel. Trainees who completed Poole's courses demonstrated measurably superior survival rates when they reached combat in Europe. This was not coincidental. The lessons Poole had acquired through brutal trial and error, lessons that had cost many other tankers their lives, were being transmitted to a new generation of commanders who could benefit from his experience without paying the equivalent price. Each commander Poole trained would subsequently lead personnel in combat, making decisions affecting the survival of their crews and the success of their missions. Some of these commanders were killed, but many survived, and survivors frequently attributed their success to their training. The knowledge Poole transmitted did not terminate with his direct students, but continued, propagating through the institutions they served. Officers who had learned from Poole subsequently developed training programs of their own, incorporating Poole's lessons into curricula that shaped following generations of armored personnel. By the time Poole died in 1991, the direct transmission chain from his training had extended across nearly 5 decades and multiple conflicts, benefiting thousands of soldiers who never learned his name but nonetheless gained from his experience. But for Poole, personally, none of this provided genuine satisfaction. He had been a warrior, and warriors fought. The intellectual understanding that his work at Fort Knox was valuable, perhaps more valuable than anything he could have accomplished by continuing to fight, did not address the emotional void his removal from combat had created. Poole had discovered something fundamental about himself during those 81 days in France. He was extraordinarily skilled at armored warfare, more skilled than almost anyone else in the American military establishment. That excellence had provided his existence with meaning and purpose in ways nothing else ever had. Being informed that he was more valuable as an instructor than as a combatant, even if this was objectively accurate, felt like being told that his greatest capability was insufficiently important to employ. The wound to his professional identity may have cut deeper than any of the physical injuries he had sustained. The question of whether Patton's decision was correct has been examined by military historians and ethics scholars since the war's conclusion. From a purely military efficiency perspective, the argument for removing Poole from combat appears strong. The mathematics of expertise transfer suggest that Poole's knowledge, properly disseminated, preserved many more lives than Poole himself could have preserved through continued fighting. The institutional knowledge argument withstands analytical scrutiny. Veterans possessing Poole's experience level were genuinely irreplaceable, and employing them as instructors represented an efficient mechanism for multiplying their impact across the entire force. The medical evidence also supported the decision. Poole's accumulated wounds and the physiological stress of extended combat had exacted a toll on his body that made further combat service genuinely hazardous. Returning him to frontline operations would likely have resulted in his death, and not necessarily in ways that accomplished anything strategically meaningful. However, Counter-arguments deserve serious consideration. Poole was not consulted regarding the decision, and his preferences were overridden without explanation. One could reasonably argue that soldiers, including enlisted personnel, possess some legitimate right to determine how they will serve, and that Poole's demonstrated competence should have earned him the right to make his own choice about continuing to fight. There is additionally the question of whether Poole's experience actually transferred effectively through training mechanisms. Some skills are inherently resistant to instruction, and Poole's intuitive approach to combat may have fallen into this category. His ability to read terrain and predict enemy behavior was not something he could articulate or decompose into teachable components. It simply existed, a product of natural ability and accumulated experience that operated through mechanisms he could not explain. How much of this intuitive capability actually transferred to his students, as opposed to the more concrete tactical lessons he could describe explicitly, remains uncertain. The broader implications of Poole's experience extend beyond the specific circumstances of his individual case. The question of how to employ extraordinary individual talent within military contexts is one that every military organization must address. On one hand, exceptional individuals can accomplish things ordinary soldiers cannot, and deploying them at front lines maximizes their immediate impact on operations. On the other hand, exceptional individuals represent concentrations of knowledge and skill that are extremely difficult to replace, and their loss can produce consequences far exceeding the immediate tactical situation. Different military traditions have approached this challenge through varying methods. Some emphasize maintaining skilled individuals in combat as long as feasible, reasoning that their presence contributes to victory and that victory ultimately saves more lives than any individual instructor could. Others prioritize preserving institutional knowledge, rotating experienced personnel to training in staff positions where they can multiply their impact across the force. The American approach during World War II varied considerably depending on the service branch, the geographic theater, and the individual commanders involved. Poole's case represents one extreme, where a combat commander operating at peak effectiveness was removed to preserve his knowledge for subsequent generations of soldiers. The psychological consequences of Poole's removal from combat should not be minimized. Combat veterans frequently report that wartime service, despite its inherent horrors, provides a sense of purpose and intensity that civilian existence cannot approach. This is particularly true for those who discovered they were exceptionally skilled at combat, whose wartime service revealed abilities they might never have known they possessed. For Poole, who had spent 81 days functioning at the absolute peak of his capabilities, the transition to a training role must have felt like profound diminishment. He went from being the most lethal tank commander in American history to being an instructor at a stateside installation, someone who talked about combat rather than participating in it. The psychological literature concerning veterans suggests that this kind of transition can be deeply traumatic, that the loss of purpose and identity associated with departing combat can cause lasting damage, even when the individual suffers no physical injuries. Poole's reported bitterness about the decision, which persisted for decades after the war, fits this pattern precisely. The question of how Poole should have been employed also raises issues regarding the relationship between individual soldiers and the military institutions they serve. Poole had not requested assignment as a training instructor. He had volunteered for combat, had demonstrated exceptional skill, and had expressed clear desire to continue fighting. The decision to remove him was made over his explicit objections by officers who believed they understood better than Poole himself what his proper role should be. From a military efficiency standpoint, this kind of top-down decision-making is entirely appropriate. Individual soldiers cannot be permitted to determine their own assignments based purely on personal preference, or military organizations would become unmanageable. But something uncomfortable remains about overriding an individual's expressed preferences, particularly when that individual has demonstrated competence at the highest level. Poole had earned the right to have his preferences taken seriously, even if the final determination appropriately rested with his superiors. Poole's post-war existence reflected the ambivalence of his wartime experience. He returned to Texas, married, raised a family, and lived a quiet civilian life until his death in 19... He rarely discussed his combat experiences except at veterans' gatherings, where he was treated as a celebrity among fellow tankers. The bitterness regarding his removal from combat never fully dissipated, even as Poole intellectually acknowledged that the decision had probably preserved his life. In interviews conducted decades after the war, Poole still expressed regret that he had not been permitted to continue fighting, still wondered what he might have accomplished if he had returned to his unit. This persistent regret suggests that Poole never fully reconciled himself to Patton's decision, that some part of him always felt that his true purpose had been taken away prematurely. The legacy Poole left extended far beyond his personal destruction tally. The hundreds of tank commanders he trained at Fort Knox went on to fight across Germany during the war's final months, applying lessons Poole had taught them in combat situations that might otherwise have proven fatal. Some of these commanders trained others subsequently, creating chains of institutional knowledge that stretched across generations. The principles Poole had discovered through brutal experimentation, principles regarding terrain reading, engagement, timing, and crew preservation, became part of the collective wisdom of American armored forces. They influenced doctrine, training programs, and tactical thinking in ways that remain difficult to trace precisely, but were undoubtedly significant. Poole's impact on the war cannot be measured solely by the 250-plus German vehicles he personally destroyed. It must also include all the lives preserved and battles won by soldiers who fought more effectively because they had benefited, directly or indirectly, from his knowledge. The narrative of Lafayette Poole offers no simple answers to the questions it raises. Was Patton correct to remove him from combat? Probably, if we measure success in terms of total lives preserved and military objectives achieved, but this analytical framework implicitly devalues Poole's own preferences and autonomy, treating him as a resource to be optimally allocated rather than as a person possessing his own desires and sense of purpose. Was Poole's combat effectiveness genuinely transferable through training, or was it too dependent on intuitive abilities that could not be taught? The evidence suggests that at least some of his knowledge transferred successfully, but the degree to which his trainees could actually replicate his results remains uncertain. Should veteran combat soldiers be permitted to continue fighting, even when military efficiency suggests they would be more valuable elsewhere? There exists no consensus answer to this question, and different military organizations continue to approach it through varying methods. What remains clear is that Poole's narrative illuminates fundamental tensions within military organizations and within human psychology more broadly. The tension between individual excellence and institutional requirements, between personal fulfillment and collective benefit, between the warrior's desire to fight and the commander's responsibility to employ resources wisely. These tensions cannot be resolved through simple formulas. They require judgment, contextual sensitivity, and recognition that reasonable people can disagree about the proper balance. Patton's decision to withdraw Poole from combat represented one possible response to these tensions, a response that prioritized institutional knowledge and long-term effectiveness over individual achievement and immediate impact. It was probably the correct decision by utilitarian standards, but it came at a cost measured in Poole's personal satisfaction and sense of purpose, a cost that Poole himself bore for the remainder of his life. To fully appreciate the magnitude of Poole's achievements, we must situate them within the broader context of armored warfare during the Second World War and examine how the institutional, technological, and human factors of that conflict created the conditions that made his remarkable record possible. The development of tank warfare doctrine during the interwar period represented one of the most significant military innovations of the 20th century, and the way different nations approached this new form of combat had profound implications for the soldiers who would eventually fight in armored vehicles. The origins of tank warfare trace back to the trenches of the First World War, where the British introduced the first operational tanks in 1916 as a solution to the deadly stalemate of trench warfare. These early machines were crude, unreliable, and tactically primitive, but they demonstrated the potential for armored vehicles to break the deadlock that had consumed millions of lives. In the years following that conflict, military theorists across multiple nations grappled with questions about how this new weapon system should be developed and employed. British theorists like JFC, Fuller and Basil Little-Hart advocated for independent armored formations capable of conducting deep penetration operations that could bypass enemy defenses and strike at critical rural area targets. French military thought traumatized by the catastrophic casualties of the previous war, emphasized the defensive potential of armor, and developed doctrine that dispersed tanks among infantry formations as support weapons. German theorists, influenced by their own painful experiences with Allied tanks and drawing on the mobile warfare concepts of their own successful late-war offensives, developed what would become known as Blitzkrieg, the Commandar's approach that synchronized tanks, motorized infantry, and close-air support to achieve rapid battlefield decisions. American tank doctrine during the interwar period was characterized by institutional confusion and bureaucratic conflict. The Army's established branches, infantry and cavalry, both claimed ownership of armored vehicles, leading to parallel development programs that produced incompatible doctrines and equipment. The infantry viewed tanks primarily as support weapons for foot soldiers, leading to designs emphasizing reliability and cooperation with dismounted troops over speed and firepower. The cavalry, prohibited by law from operating tanks due to infantry branch prerogatives, developed combat cars that were essentially light tanks under a different name, emphasizing mobility and reconnaissance capabilities. This institutional fragmentation prevented the development of a coherent American approach to armored warfare until after the German victories in Poland and France demonstrated the devastating potential of concentrated armor operations. The creation of the U.S. Armored Force in 1940 represented an attempt to rationalize American tank doctrine, but the debates about how armor should be employed continued throughout the war. Some commanders, influenced by the German example, advocated for aggressive, independent armored operations. Others remained committed to the tank-infantry cooperation model that had characterized earlier American thinking. This doctrinal uncertainty had practical implications for how American tankers were trained and equipped. The Sherman tank that Poole would later command was designed according to requirements that reflected multiple, sometimes contradictory, operational concepts. It needed to be produced in massive quantities to support the global war effort, requiring manufacturing simplicity. It needed to be transportable across oceans and maintainable, with limited logistics infrastructure, demanding mechanical reliability. It needed to support infantry operations effectively, while also being capable of exploitation and pursuit missions. These diverse requirements produced a tank that was adequate for many purposes, but optimal for none. The German tanks that Poole faced during his combat career represented a different design philosophy that prioritized individual vehicle capability over mass production. The Panzer IV, which Poole encountered most frequently during the Normandy campaign, had evolved from a pre-war design into a capable medium tank through successive upgrades to its armor and armament. Its 75mm high-velocity gun could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges exceeding a kilometer, while its frontal armor provided reasonable protection against the Sherman's standard 75mm weapon, the Panther A tank, which Poole encountered increasingly during the pursuit across France and the Lorraine campaign, represented a new generation of German armor, developed in response to the Soviet T-34. Its long 75mm gun could destroy Shermans at ranges where the Sherman's weapon was ineffective, and its sloped frontal armor was essentially impervious to standard Sherman ammunition at normal combat ranges. The Tiger tank, though less commonly encountered, represented the pinnacle of German heavy tank design. With armor thick enough to shrug off virtually any Allied tank gun and an 88mm main weapon that could destroy any Allied tank at extreme range. The statistical reality facing Sherman crews was brutal. Studies conducted during and after the war attempted to quantify the exchange ratios between Sherman and German tank types, and while the specific numbers varied depending on methodology and the engagements examined, the general picture was consistent. Sherman crews faced significant disadvantages in direct confrontations with contemporary German armor. This reality shaped American tactical doctrine, which emphasized avoiding head-on engagements, using terrain and maneuver to achieve flank shots, and employing numerical superiority to overwhelm individual German tanks. These tactical principles were sound at the operational level, but they provided limited comfort to the individual crews who had to implement them while under fire from weapons that could destroy their vehicles with single hits. Poole's approach to this tactical problem diverged radically from standard doctrine, and understanding why his methods worked requires examining the psychological and physical dynamics of tank combat during this era. Tank engagements in the 1940s were characterized by severe sensory limitations for the crews involved. Vision from inside a tank was restricted to narrow periscope views and observation slits that provided limited fields of view. Noise levels inside fighting vehicles were extreme, making communication difficult and adding to the psychological stress of combat. The physical environment was cramped, hot in summer and cold in winter, with the ever-present smell of fuel, oil, and propellant, creating an atmosphere that many veterans described as oppressive. Under these conditions, maintaining situational awareness was extraordinarily challenging, and the cognitive load on tank commanders was immense. Poole's unusual ability to maintain accurate mental maps of the battlefield under these conditions represented a significant advantage over both his American peers and his German opponents. His crew members described how Poole seemed to know instinctively where threats would emerge, how he could predict enemy movements before they occurred, and how he maintained awareness of multiple engagements simultaneously while making split-second decisions about which targets to prioritize. This cognitive capability, combined with his exceptional gunnery skills and mechanical intuition, created a combat approach that was effective precisely because it violated the assumptions underlying Standard Doctrine. Standard Doctrine assumed that Sherman crews could not consistently win direct confrontations with German armor, and this assumption was statistically accurate for average crews. But Poole was not an average crew commander. His ability to acquire and engage targets faster than German gunners could respond, his skill at keeping his tank in constant motion to complicate enemy firing solutions, and his intuitive understanding of where German defensive positions would be located gave him advantages that partially compensated for his equipment's limitations. His aggressive tactics worked because they denied German gunners the stable, predictable targets they needed to exploit their range and accuracy advantages. A rapidly moving Sherman, commanded by someone who knew where the enemy was and could engage them first, became a far more dangerous adversary than the statistics suggested. The psychological dimensions of Poole's combat effectiveness deserve careful examination. Combat psychology research has identified several factors that distinguish exceptional combat performers from their peers. These include physiological stress tolerance, which allows some individuals to maintain cognitive function under conditions that impair most people, pattern recognition capabilities that enable rapid threat identification, decision-making speed that permits action before opponents can respond, and what researchers have termed combat intuition, an ability to integrate information below conscious awareness and arrive at tactically sound conclusions through mechanisms the individual cannot articulate. Poole appears to have possessed all these capabilities to unusual degrees. His calm demeanor under fire, noted by his crew members and superior officers alike, suggests exceptional stress tolerance. His ability to identify threats and predict enemy positions indicates highly developed pattern recognition. His rapid engagement sequences demonstrate superior decision-making speed. And his repeated references to targets just looking right or positions being where I would put them suggest the kind of intuitive processing that characterizes exceptional combat performers. The question of whether these capabilities were innate or developed through experience remains debated among military psychologists. Some research suggests that certain individuals possess neurological characteristics that predispose them to excel in high-stress combat situations, including variations in stress hormone regulation, neural processing speed, and working memory capacity. Other studies emphasize the role of early life experiences in developing combat-relevant skills, noting that individuals who grow up in physically demanding environments requiring rapid adaptation and mechanical problem-solving may develop cognitive patterns that transfer to combat situations. Poole's background: growing up on Depression-era Texas farms, where survival required physical labor, mechanical improvisation, and constant adaptation to challenging circumstances, certainly provided experiences that could develop such capabilities. The truth likely involves some combination of innate predisposition and experiential development, with Poole's natural abilities being refined and focused by the demanding environment of his youth. The specific engagements Poole fought during his 81 days of combat provide concrete examples of his tactical methods and their effectiveness. The Normandy breakout operation in late July 1944, which followed weeks of costly hedgerow fighting, presented particular challenges for American armor. The bocage terrain of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows, creating natural defensive barriers, had negated many of the advantages that mobile warfare theorists had promised for armor. Tanks advancing through hedgerow country were channeled into predictable routes, exposed to close-range ambushes from concealed anti-tank weapons, and unable to mass for the kind of overwhelming attacks that had characterized German successes earlier in the war. American losses during the hedgerow fighting were severe, and morale among tank crews had suffered accordingly. Poole's performance during this difficult period demonstrated his ability to adapt his aggressive tactics to constrained terrain, rather than the long-range maneuver warfare that would characterize the pursuit across France. Hedgerow fighting required close combat where engagements occurred at ranges of hundreds of meters or less. Poole modified his approach to these conditions while maintaining his fundamental philosophy of aggressive action. He developed techniques for using the hedgerows themselves as concealment, positioning his tank to engage enemies as they exposed themselves while using the terrain features that hindered movement as protection against return fire. His gunnery skills, honed through months of training and the early combat at Utah Beach, allowed him to place rounds accurately through the narrow gaps in hedgerow terrain that offered firing opportunities, and his intuitive understanding of defensive positioning allowed him to predict where German anti-tank guns would be emplaced, often engaging these threats before they could fire. The Operation Cobra breakout in late July transformed the tactical situation dramatically. The massive preliminary bombardment, followed by concentrated armored thrusts through gaps in the German lines, shattered the defensive crust that had contained American forces for weeks. Suddenly, the terrain opened up, roads became available for rapid movement, and the pursuit across France began. For tankers like Poole, this represented the operational environment they had trained for, and the kill counts reflected this changed reality. Poole's destruction totals during the pursuit dwarfed anything achieved during the hedgerow fighting, as retreating German columns provided target-rich environments and the defensive advantages that had protected German positions in Normandy evaporated. The Falaise Pocket operation in mid-August represented the culmination of the Normandy campaign and provided Poole with his most productive single day of combat. The German forces caught in the developing encirclement faced annihilation if they could not escape before the Allied pincers closed, and their desperate attempts to withdraw created traffic jams of men and equipment on the limited road network available. Poole positioned his tank at a critical choke point and systematically destroyed everything that attempted to pass. The 17 vehicle kills he recorded that day represented just a fraction of the destruction inflicted by American forces during the Pocketus closure, but they exemplified the kind of decisive results that aggressive tank commanders could achieve when circumstances favored their tactics. The transition to the Lorraine campaign in September brought new challenges that tested Poole's adaptability. The terrain of eastern France differed significantly from both the Bocage country of Normandy and the open fields of the pursuit. Rolling hills, covered with mixed forest and farmland, created a landscape that offered defensive advantages without the extreme constraints of the hedgerows. German forces, reinforced by troops withdrawn from other sectors and equipped with additional anti-tank weapons, established defensive positions that exploited this terrain effectively. American casualty rates increased as the advance slowed, and the grinding combat of Lorraine bore little resemblance to the sweeping maneuvers that had characterized the previous month. Poole's wounding on September 15 occurred during an engagement that illustrated the changed tactical dynamics of the Lorraine campaign. The ambush that ended his combat career was well-planned and effectively executed, with German anti-tank guns positioned to create crossing fires that caught American tanks in a kill zone with limited options for maneuver or escape. Poole's immediate reaction, aggressive movement to engage the primary threat, was characteristic of his tactical approach, but on this occasion, the German gunners had created a situation where aggressive response led directly into their fires. The round that struck Poole's tank penetrated because it achieved a favorable angle against the Sherman's thinner side armor, exactly the vulnerability that German defensive positions were designed to exploit. The specific circumstances of Poole's final wounding raise questions about whether his aggressive tactics had become liabilities in the changed tactical environment of the Lorraine campaign. Some military historians have argued that Poole's approach, so effective during the mobile warfare of the Normandy breakout and pursuit, was poorly suited to the more deliberate combat of eastern France. The aggressive maneuvers that had allowed Poole to overwhelm German defenses during the summer became increasingly hazardous as German forces adapted to American tactics and prepared positions specifically designed to counter aggressive American armor. From this perspective, Poole's wounding was not simply bad luck, but a predictable consequence of tactics that had outlived their effectiveness. Other analysts reject this interpretation, arguing that Poole's wounding was primarily a matter of circumstances rather than tactical failure. The ambush that caught Poole's platoon was well executed by German standards, and even the most skillful American tank commander would have faced severe challenges in that situation. Poole's immediate reaction, aggressive engagement of the primary threat, was arguably the correct tactical response. The alternative of attempting to withdraw under fire would likely have resulted in even higher casualties. From this perspective, Poole's survival through 81 days of combat was the remarkable achievement, and his eventual wounding was simply the statistical reality of armored warfare catching up with an individual who had evaded it for far longer than probability suggested was possible. The medical aspects of Poole's combat wounds provide insight into the physical realities of armored warfare during this period. Tank crewmen faced distinctive injury patterns that reflected the environment of their fighting vehicles. Penetrating rounds could produce shrapnel injuries throughout the confined crew compartment, as fragments of armor, ammunition, and equipment were propelled by the energy of the impact. Fire was a constant threat, as the combination of fuel, ammunition, and lubricants inside tanks created highly combustible environments that could turn crew compartments into furnaces within seconds of a penetrating hit. The burns suffered by surviving tank crewmen were often severe and permanently disfiguring, and the psychological trauma of seeing crew members burned to death was common among tank veterans. Poole's wounds on September 15th included the kind of shrapnel injuries typical of penetrating hits, with fragments from the German round and the Sherman's own armor embedding in his torso and severely damaging his leg. The fact that he survived with his leg intact was attributed by his medical team to the specific geometry of the hit, which apparently directed most of the explosive force and fragments away from the lower crew positions. His earlier wounds had followed similar patterns, with shrapnel causing the primary damage in each case. The cumulative effect of these injuries, as noted by medical officers who examined Poole after his final wounding, had taken a significant toll on his overall physical condition, leaving him in a weakened state that would require extended recovery even beyond the healing of his immediate wounds. The decision-making process that led to Poole's permanent removal from combat involved multiple levels of the military hierarchy and reflected the complex considerations that shape personnel decisions in wartime. At the immediate level, Poole's medical condition clearly required extended treatment and recovery, making any return to combat impossible in the short term. But the decision went beyond medical considerations to address the broader question of how Poole could best contribute to the war effort. This determination involved inputs from medical officers who assessed his physical capacity for future combat, from his chain of command, who evaluated his tactical value, and the morale implications of his presence or absence, and from the highest levels of 3rd Army headquarters, where General Patton personally reviewed the case. Patton's involvement in Poole's case reflected the General's hands-on approach to command and his interest in exceptional personnel. Patton had built his reputation partly on his ability to identify and employ talented subordinates, and he paid attention to the performances of individual soldiers who demonstrated unusual capabilities. Poole's record had come to Patton's attention through the normal reporting channels, and the general had reportedly expressed both admiration for Poole's achievements and concern about the sustainability of his aggressive approach. When Poole's final wounding provided an opportunity to reconsider his assignment, Patton apparently concluded that the balance of considerations favored removing him from combat permanently. The reasoning behind this decision, as reconstructed from surviving documentation and the recollections of those involved, emphasized the value of Poole's accumulated combat knowledge and the importance of transmitting this knowledge to future tank commanders. The training facilities at Fort Knox were producing tank crews at rates necessary to replace the Army's mounting losses. But the quality of training these crews received was limited by the availability of combat-experienced instructors. Veterans who had survived extended combat and developed effective tactical approaches were rare, and their expertise was in high demand for training programs. Poole represented an exceptional concentration of such expertise, and employing him as an instructor could multiply his impact across hundreds or thousands of future tankers. The countervailing considerations, including Poole's own preference to return to combat and the morale boost his presence provided to his unit, were apparently weighed and found less compelling than the training argument. Poole's crew could be assigned to another commander, and the 3rd Armored Division would continue to function effectively without him. But the knowledge Poole possessed about how to survive and succeed in Sherman tanks could not be easily replaced. And if Poole returned to combat and was killed, that knowledge would be lost permanently. From a coldly analytical perspective, the choice seemed clear. Poole's maximum value to the war effort lay in training rather than fighting, and the decision should be made on that basis regardless of Poole's personal preferences. This analytical framework for personnel decisions reflects a utilitarian approach to military human resources that has been both praised and criticized by subsequent analysts. The utilitarian argument holds that military personnel should be employed wherever they can contribute most effectively to overall victory, regardless of individual preferences or considerations of fairness. If Poole's expertise could save more lives by being transmitted to other tankers than by being employed in direct combat, then the utilitarian calculation clearly favored the training assignment. Individual preferences, while worthy of consideration, cannot override the collective good when lives and military objectives are at stake. Critics of this approach argue that it treats soldiers as interchangeable resources rather than autonomous individuals with legitimate claims to determine their own service. Poole had volunteered for combat and had earned through his performance the right to have his preferences respected. The military's decision to override his clearly expressed wishes without explanation and without opportunity for meaningful appeal represented an arbitrary exercise of institutional power that disregarded Poole's agency as an individual. From this perspective, the decision may have been strategically sound, but it was ethically problematic in ways that utilitarian calculations cannot capture. The tension between these perspectives is not easily resolved, and different military organizations and different eras have balanced these considerations differently. Modern military personnel systems generally provide more scope for individual input into assignment decisions, though the military's ultimate authority to assign personnel where needed remains intact. The increasing emphasis on individual rights and personal autonomy in contemporary Western societies has influenced military practice, creating expectations that soldiers will be consulted about their careers and that their preferences will be given weight. But the fundamental tension between institutional requirements and individual desires remains, and cases like Poole's continue to raise questions about where the proper balance lies. Poole's experience at Fort Knox, following his removal from combat, provides insight into the practical challenges of expertise transfer in military settings. The knowledge Poole possessed about effective tank tactics existed primarily in tacit form, encoded in his intuitions and instincts, rather than in explicit propositions that could be easily communicated. When Poole described how he identified likely positions for German anti-tank guns, he could point to features of the terrain that influenced his judgments, but he could not fully articulate the mental processes that produced his conclusions. His students could learn the explicit principles Poole identified, but whether they could acquire the intuitive capabilities that made those principles actionable in combat was uncertain. This challenge of transferring tacit knowledge is well recognized in educational and organizational research. Experts in many domains possess capabilities that they cannot fully explain or teach, skills that have been developed through extensive practice and experience, but that operate through cognitive processes below conscious awareness. Attempts to codify such expertise in explicit form often fail to capture the essential elements that make it effective, producing rules and principles that lack the nuanced judgment of the original expert. Poole's training program faced this challenge directly, attempting to transmit knowledge that was partly ineffable to students, who would need to apply it in circumstances where mistakes could be fatal. Poole's approach to this challenge combined explicit instruction with experiential learning methods designed to develop intuitive capabilities. His classroom teaching covered the explicit tactical principles he had identified, including terrain analysis techniques, engagement sequences, and common German tactical patterns. But he supplemented this explicit instruction with field exercises that required students to make rapid decisions under simulated combat conditions, attempting to develop the kind of intuitive judgment that characterized his own performance. He also shared stories from his own combat experiences, using narrative as a medium for conveying tacit knowledge that could not be reduced to explicit principles. The effectiveness of Poole's training program was assessed through multiple measures, including performance evaluations during training, subsequent combat survival rates, and feedback from former students who served in Europe. The available evidence suggests that Pool's students performed measurably better than those trained through standard programs, though isolating the specific contribution of Poolless instruction from other factors that influenced combat outcomes is methodologically challenging. Some studies found that tank commanders who had trained under Pool had higher survival rates during their initial combat engagements, the period when mortality rates were typically highest. Others noted that units receiving commanders trained by Pool reported better tactical performance and fewer losses to common tactical mistakes. While none of this evidence definitively proves that Pool's training was superior, the pattern of findings is consistent with the hypothesis that his instruction provided meaningful benefits to his students. The broader implications of Poolless training role for military education have been explored by scholars examining how combat expertise can be effectively transmitted. The traditional model of military training, emphasizing standardized instruction based on doctrinal principles, has limitations when dealing with capabilities that are inherently difficult to codify. Pool's experience suggests that combat expertise has significant tacit components that require alternative transmission methods, including experiential learning, narrative instruction, and mentorship relationships that allow for extended observation and feedback. Modern military training programs have increasingly incorporated such methods, recognizing that effective performance in combat requires more than the application of explicit rules. The comparison between Pool and other notable tank commanders of the Second World War provides context for assessing his achievements. Michael Wittmann, the German Tiger tank ace, accumulated a higher absolute kill count than Pool, but operated a vastly superior vehicle. Against opponents who often lacked any effective means of engaging his tank, Wittmann's tire could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where Allied weapons were ineffective against its heavy armor, creating tactical conditions fundamentally different from those Pool faced in his Sherman. Wittmann also fought for a significantly longer period before his death in combat in August 1944, providing more opportunities to accumulate kills. When Pool's achievements are evaluated relative to the capabilities of his equipment and the duration of his combat service, they appear even more remarkable than raw numbers suggest. Soviet tank aces like Dmitry Lev credited Wheat 52 kills before his death in December 1941, operated under different conditions that make direct comparison difficult. The Eastern Front's scale, intensity, and tactical dynamics differed substantially from the Western European theater, and Soviet tanks faced different opponents and employed different tactics. Lavrenko's achievement of 52 kills in approximately 4 months of combat represents an impressive rate of destruction. But the circumstances of the German invasion of the Soviet Union created target-rich environments that were not always available in the Western theater. The comparison illustrates the difficulty of evaluating individual performance across different contexts and the importance of considering circumstances when assessing military achievements. British tank commander Sidney Radley Walters accumulated the highest kill count among Western Allied tank commanders, but achieved this total over a longer combat period and under different circumstances than Pool's combat career began before D-Day and continued through the war's end, providing significantly more time to accumulate kills than Pool's truncated 81 days. When adjusted for duration of combat, Pool's rate of destruction substantially exceeded Radley Walters, suggesting that Pool was operating at a higher level of combat effectiveness despite facing similar opponents with similar equipment. These comparisons highlight the difficulty of identifying a single greatest tank commander of the Second World War. Different metrics favor different individuals, and the circumstances of combat varied so substantially across theaters and time periods that direct comparisons are problematic. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Pool's achievement of over 250 confirmed vehicle kills in just 81 days of combat, accomplished in a tank widely considered inferior to most of his opponents, represents one of the most impressive sustained performances of any tank commander in the Western European theater. Whether this makes him the greatest is ultimately a matter of definition and perspective. The technological context of Pool's achievements merits attention because it shaped both the opportunities and the constraints within which he operated. The M4 Sherman that Pool commanded represented a specific moment in the evolution of tank technology, incorporating lessons from early war combat while remaining limited by the constraints of 1940s engineering and manufacturing. The vehicle's automotive systems, based on existing commercial truck components, provided reliability but limited performance. Its armor, designed to be producible in quantity with available materials and manufacturing techniques, offered protection against small arms and light anti-tank weapons, but struggled against the high-velocity guns of late war. German tanks. Its main armament, the 75mm M3 gun mounted on early Sherman variants, had been designed for infantry support rather than tank combat and was increasingly outclassed by German vehicles as the war progressed. The specific Sherman variant Pool operated during his combat career appears to have been an M4A1, characterized by its cast, hull construction, and the original 75mm gun. Later Sherman variants incorporated improvements including thicker armor, better guns, and improved ammunition, but Pool achieved his record with equipment that represented the earlier, less capable end of the Sherman spectrum. This makes his achievements even more remarkable, as he succeeded with tools that were demonstrably inferior to both his opponent's equipment and to the improved Shermans that became available later in the war. The ammunition Pool's crew employed also influenced his tactical options. The standard 75mm ammunition, available during the summer of 1944, included armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate German medium tank armor under favorable conditions, but struggled against the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers. High-explosive rounds were effective against infantry, positions, and soft-skinned vehicles, but largely useless against armored targets. The ammunition limitations forced Pool to rely on flanking maneuvers and precisely aim shots at vulnerable points. Tactical approaches that demanded exceptional skill, but that could partially compensate for technological disadvantages. The communication and coordination systems available during this period also shaped Pool's tactical options. Radio equipment in Sherman tanks was unreliable and often failed during combat, leaving tank commanders dependent on visual signals and pre-planned maneuvers for coordination with other vehicles. Pool's preference for leading from the front, with his tank visible to subordinate vehicles, was partly a response to these communication limitations, ensuring that his platoon could follow his example even when radios failed. This approach increased his personal risk but improved the coordination of his unit's actions, a trade-off that Pool apparently considered worthwhile. The evolution of anti-tank weapons during this period created additional challenges that Pool had to address. German infantry units were increasingly equipped with handheld anti-tank weapons, like the Pen, which could destroy Sherman tanks at close range. These weapons were particularly dangerous in urban areas and close terrain, where infantry could approach tanks without being detected. Pool's survival depended partly on maintaining situational awareness that allowed him to detect and engage such threats before they could fire, a capability that his infantry support appreciated but that required constant vigilance. The logistical support systems that sustained Pool's combat operations deserve recognition as essential enablers of his achievements. Tank warfare consumes enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, and Pool's sustained combat effectiveness depended on supply systems that kept these resources flowing to the front. The American logistical system, while sometimes criticized for inefficiencies, generally succeeded in providing tank units with the materials they needed to continue fighting. Pool's crew reportedly developed efficient techniques for rapid rearming and refueling that minimized their vulnerability during these necessary pauses. But the basic availability of supplies was a prerequisite for their continued operations. The human dimensions of Pool's crew relationships contributed significantly to his combat effectiveness. Tank crews in the Second World War developed intense bonds forged by the shared experience of combat in confined spaces, and Pool's crew demonstrated exceptional cohesion and coordination. His loader, Wilbert Richards, had developed the ability to anticipate Pool's fire commands and have rounds ready before they were called for. His driver could interpret Pool's steering directions through subtle body language and voice, maintaining vehicle control during the complex maneuvers Pool's tactics required. His bow gunner and assistant driver provided suppressive fire and assisted with observation, contributing to the situational awareness that characterized Pool's command style. This crew coordination, developed over months of training and combat, represented a collective capability that exceeded what any individual crew member could have achieved alone. The psychological pressures on Pool's crew were substantial, and their ability to maintain performance despite these pressures reflects exceptional resilience. Tank combat was characterized by sudden violence, with engagements often decided in seconds, and the knowledge that any moment could bring death was a constant companion for armored vehicle crews. Pool's crew had witnessed the destruction of other tanks and the deaths of friends and colleagues. Experiences that psychological research shows can produce significant stress reactions. Their continued effective performance, despite these pressures, suggests either exceptional individual stress tolerance or effective coping mechanisms that allowed them to function despite their psychological burden. The supportive relationships within the crew, including Poole's leadership style and the mutual trust that developed among crew members, may have contributed to their sustained effectiveness. The question of how Poole's removal from combat affected his crew merits consideration. These men had developed deep relationships with Poole and had come to rely on his leadership for their survival. His sudden removal, following his wounding, disrupted these relationships and required the crew to adapt to new leadership under continued combat conditions. The available evidence suggests that Poole's crew continued to perform effectively after his departure, eventually being assigned to other commanders who led them through the remaining months of the war. Some crew members survived to the war's end. Others did not. The long-term effects of the disruption caused by Poole's removal on crew performance and well-being are not clearly documented, but the experience of abrupt leadership change under combat conditions was common in the military of this era and represents an underappreciated source of stress for military personnel. The institutional context within which Poole served, the 3rd Armored Division, shaped his combat experience in ways that merit examination. The division, known as the Spearhead Division, for its role in leading Third Army's advance, had developed an aggressive tactical culture that supported Poole's approach to combat. Division leadership encouraged initiative and boldness among subordinate commanders, creating an environment where Poole's unconventional tactics were tolerated and even celebrated rather than being suppressed by risk-averse superiors. This organizational culture was not universal in the American military of this era. Other divisions maintained more conservative approaches that emphasized caution and coordination over individual initiative. Poole's achievements were enabled partly by the specific institutional context in which he served. The 3rd Armored Division's history before Poole joined illustrated the challenges facing American armor in the European theater. The division had arrived in Normandy in June 1944 and immediately experienced the brutal attrition that characterized hedgerow fighting. By the time the breakout began, the division had already suffered significant losses and had developed hard-won knowledge about the realities of combat against German defenders. Poole benefited from this institutional experience, absorbing lessons learned by others before developing his own distinctive approach. The division's willingness to grant subordinate commanders tactical autonomy allowed Poole to implement his unconventional methods, and the division's aggressive reputation attracted soldiers who shared Poole's offensive mindset. The relationship between Poole and his immediate superiors influenced his tactical freedom and his eventual fate. Poole's company and battalion commanders had apparently developed confidence in his judgment, granting him latitude to operate independently that might not have been extended to less proven subordinates. This trust allowed Poole to pursue tactics that diverged from standard doctrine, trusting his judgment about when aggressive action was appropriate. The same superiors, however, were also responsible for evaluating his wounds and making recommendations about his fitness for continued service, decisions that would ultimately lead to his permanent removal from combat. The relationship between trust in subordinate judgment and responsibility for subordinate welfare created tensions that Poole's case illustrates clearly. The broader strategic context of September 1944 influenced the decision to remove Poole from combat. T's point, the Allied advance had outrun its supply lines, and the logistics crisis, known as the broad front versus narrow front debate, was consuming attention at the highest command levels. Patton's Third Army was operating at the end of a supply chain stretched to its limits, and shortages of fuel and ammunition were constraining operations. At the same time, planning for the expected final campaigns against Germany was underway, and the need for trained personnel to replace anticipated losses was becoming urgent. Poole's reassignment to training duties should be understood in this context, as part of a larger effort to prepare the forces that would be needed for the campaigns of 1945. The ethical dimensions of Poole's story extend beyond the specific question of whether he should have been removed from combat to encompass broader questions about violence, warfare, and human value. Poole was celebrated during his lifetime and continues to be remembered for his exceptional skill at destroying enemy military equipment and, necessarily, the human beings who crewed that equipment. His kill count, the metric by which his achievement is primarily measured, represents hundreds of German soldiers killed or wounded. These were young men, mostly conscripts, who faced Pool not because of personal animosity but because their government ordered them into combat against the Allied forces. Celebrating Pool's effectiveness means celebrating the deaths of these men, treating their destruction as an achievement worthy of admiration. The moral complexity of this celebration is not resolved by noting that the German military served a regime of exceptional evil, or that the individual soldiers Pool killed might have included true believers in Nazi ideology. The reality is that Pool's victims were primarily ordinary soldiers doing what they were told, just as Pool himself was following orders and doing his duty. The circumstances of World War II, where the Axis powers initiated aggressive wars and committed atrocities that demanded military response, provide moral context for the violence Pool committed, but they do not eliminate the tragedy inherent in the deaths of young men. On both sides, Pool's story invites reflection on how we think about military excellence and whether the skills involved in effective combat should be objects of celebration or simply accepted as necessities in an imperfect world. Pool's own apparent ambivalence about the moral dimensions of his service is noteworthy. In post-war interviews, he generally avoided discussing the human cost of his combat achievements, focusing instead on tactical challenges and technical details. Tieframing, common among combat veterans, may serve important psychological functions by allowing individuals to process their experiences without being overwhelmed by guilt or moral distress. But it also obscures the human reality behind the statistics. Pool's crew members similarly tended to discuss combat in technical rather than human terms, describing engagements in the language of gunnery and maneuver rather than killing. Whether this represents genuine psychological compartmentalization or simply a social norm about appropriate discourse is difficult to determine from available evidence. The commemoration of Pool's service has taken various forms over the decades since the war. He received numerous military decorations, including the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart, with multiple oak leaf clusters. A tank training range at Fort Knox was named in his honor, and his story has been featured in numerous publications, documentaries, and educational programs about the Second World War. The 3rd Armored Division maintained his memory as part of its institutional heritage until the division's deactivation, and veteran organizations continue to honor his achievements. These commemorations serve important functions for military institutions and for the broader society, preserving memory of those who served and providing examples of excellence for future generations. Yet Pool himself appeared somewhat uncomfortable with public recognition of his wartime service. Veterans who knew him described a quiet man who preferred the company of fellow soldiers, who understood his experiences to the admiration of civilians who could only imagine what combat had been like. This ambivalence about recognition is common among combat veterans and reflects the profound gap between those who have experienced war and those who have not. Pool's achievements were real and worthy of recognition, but the recognition often seemed to miss what Pool considered most important about his experience: the bonds with his crew members, the intensity of combat, and the complex emotions that accompanied both. Public commemoration necessarily simplifies and sanitizes the experiences it honors, creating narratives that serve social functions but may not capture the reality as experienced by those involved. The comparative analyses of how different militaries handled exceptional combat performers during the Second World War reveals varying approaches to the tension between immediate effectiveness and long-term knowledge preservation. The German military frequently kept high-performing individuals in combat until they were killed, using them for propaganda purposes and to boost unit morale. This approach produced famous aces with impressive kill counts, but also meant that the institutional knowledge these individuals accumulated was often lost when they died. Whitman, the Tiger Ace, represents this pattern. His death at Villers-Bocage came before any systematic effort to extract and transmit his tactical knowledge. The Soviet military sometimes rotated successful pilots and tank commanders to training and propaganda roles, but also used them heavily for publicity purposes that kept them in combat. German ace Erich Hartmann's Soviet counterparts often died in combat or in subsequent political purges, taking their knowledge with them. The American approach, as exemplified by Pool's case, represented an attempt to balance immediate effectiveness against knowledge preservation, though the balance was struck differently in different cases and under different circumstances. The decision to remove Poole appears to have been driven primarily by the recognition of his exceptional expertise and the desire to preserve it for institutional benefit. Other American aces, in both ground and air combat, were handled differently depending on the specific circumstances and the judgments of their commanders. The lack of a consistent policy across the American military suggests that individual decisions were made on case-by-case basis, with results that varied depending on the individuals involved and the specific considerations that applied. The question of what lessons Poole's experience offers for contemporary military organizations remains relevant. Modern militaries continue to grapple with the challenge of developing and preserving combat expertise, though the specific mechanisms have evolved significantly since the 1940s. Advanced simulation technologies allow for more realistic training without the risks of actual combat, potentially reducing the dependency on combat experience for developing tactical proficiency. Knowledge management systems attempt to capture and codify expertise that was previously lost when individuals left service. Mentorship programs pair experienced personnel with newcomers in ways that facilitate the transfer of tacit knowledge. Yet the fundamental challenge remains. The most valuable combat knowledge often exists in forms that resist easy transmission, and the individuals who possess this knowledge may prefer continued combat service to the teaching roles that would maximize their institutional value. The psychological dimensions of transitioning from combat to training roles have received increased attention in recent decades. INFORMED. Partly by research on veterans from more recent conflicts, studies have documented the challenges that exceptional combat performers face when they can no longer engage in the activities that defined their identities and provided their sense of purpose. The loss of the combat environment, with its intense camaraderie and clear sense of mission, can produce feelings of emptiness and alienation that persist long after the physical return to civilian or garrison life. Poole's reported lifelong regret about being removed from combat fits this pattern and suggests that the psychological costs of such transitions were real and lasting. Modern military mental health services have developed programs to support personnel transitioning from combat roles, but the effectiveness of these programs for individuals with Poole's profile remains uncertain. The exceptional performer who has discovered extraordinary capabilities in combat may face distinctive challenges that differ from those of ordinary soldiers returning from deployment. The loss of a role that perfectly matched their abilities and provided maximal challenge and meaning may create a void that subsequent roles cannot fill. Poole's experience suggests that intellectual understanding of the value of training work does not automatically translate into emotional satisfaction with that role, and that institutional recognition of expertise does not necessarily compensate for the loss of the combat environment. The technological evolution of armored warfare since Poole's era has transformed the tactical realities his successors face, but some of the principles he embodied remain relevant. Modern tanks incorporate computerized fire control systems that handle many of the calculations Poole had to perform intuitively, but the fundamental importance of situational awareness, terrain reading, and tactical judgment remains unchanged. The rise of precision anti-tank weapons has made the battlefield more lethal for armored vehicles, increasing the premium on the kind of threat identification skills Poole demonstrated, and the human dimensions of tank crew performance, including the importance of crew cohesion, leadership, and the ability to function under extreme stress, remain as relevant now as they were in 1944. The memory of Lafayette Poole serves important functions for military institutions and for society more broadly. For military organizations, his story provides an example of individual excellence that can inspire and motivate personnel, while also raising questions about how such excellence should be developed, employed, and preserved. For society, his narrative illuminates the experience of combat in ways that can inform public understanding of what military service entails and what it costs those who provide it. The discomfort his story may provoke regarding the celebration of violence, the treatment of soldiers as resources, and the psychological costs of combat excellence serves valuable purposes by preventing the sanitization of war's reality. Lafayette Green Pool, America's most effective tank commander, died in Texas in 1991, nearly half a century after the war that made him famous. He spent those decades in relative obscurity, living a quiet civilian life that bore little resemblance to the intensity of his wartime service. He never stopped wondering what might have happened if he had been allowed to return to his crew after his third wounding. Never stopped believing that he had more fighting in him. The decision to remove him from combat was almost certainly correct from a strategic perspective, but correctness provided no comfort to a man who had been forced to abandon the only thing he had ever been truly exceptional at. His story stands as a reminder that even the best decisions have costs, that military necessity sometimes requires sacrificing individual fulfillment for collective benefit, and that those who serve their countries in war may carry the consequences of that service and of the decisions made about them for the rest of their lives. The enduring significance of Poulet's narrative lies not merely in the impressive statistics of his combat record, but in the deeper questions his experience raises about the nature of excellence, the obligations institutions owe to exceptional individuals, and the psychological realities of combat service. His 81 days of fighting produced results that statistical analysis suggests should have been impossible achieved through a combination of natural ability, developed skill, and tactical judgment that remains difficult to explain fully, even with the benefit of decades of subsequent research. The decision to end his combat career at its peak represented a defensible choice that probably maximized his total contribution to the war effort, but it came at a personal cost that Poulet bore until his death. The questions Poulet's story raises about the proper relationship between individual talent and institutional need remain as relevant today as they were in 1944. How should organizations identify and develop exceptional performers? How should they balance the immediate contributions such individuals can make against the long-term value of preserving and transmitting their knowledge? How should individual preferences be weighed against institutional requirements? What obligations do organizations owe to individuals who have demonstrated extraordinary capability but can no longer exercise it? These questions have no simple answers, and different circumstances will continue to call for different approaches. Poulet's experience provides a detailed case study that can inform but not resolve these enduring dilemmas. The final measure of Poulet's legacy combines both his direct combat achievements and his subsequent training contributions. The 250-plus German vehicles he destroyed represented immediate contributions to Allied victory in the European theater. The hundreds of tank commanders he trained carried his knowledge into the final campaigns of the war and beyond, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond what his continued combat service could have achieved. His institutional knowledge has propagated through generations of American armored personnel, shaping doctrine and training in ways that are difficult to trace precisely but undoubtedly significant. By any reasonable accounting, Poulet's total contribution to American military effectiveness substantially exceeded what he could have achieved by continuing to fight, even if he had survived the war's end. Yet this accounting framework, which treats Poulet's life as a resource to be optimized for collective benefit, sits uncomfortably with perspectives that emphasize individual autonomy and the right of persons to determine how they will contribute to causes larger than themselves. Poulet wanted to fight, had demonstrated exceptional capacity for fighting, and was denied the opportunity to continue doing what he did best. The justifications for this denial were sound by military and utilitarian standards, but they overrode Poulet's expressed preferences in ways that Poulet himself never fully accepted. His persistent regret about being removed from combat stands as testimony to the personal costs of decisions that serve collective interests at individual expense. The tank warfare that Poulet mastered has continued to evolve through subsequent decades, with each generation of technology and doctrine building on lessons learned in previous conflicts. The principles Poulet discovered through brutal trial and error, principles about reading terrain, engaging enemies aggressively but intelligently, and keeping crews alive under the most demanding conditions, have been incorporated into training programs and doctrinal publications that shape how contemporary tankers prepare for and conduct combat operations. His specific techniques may have become obsolete with technological change, but the underlying insights about the nature of armored combat retain their validity. Modern tankers face different equipment and different threats, but they still must master terrain, outthink their opponents, and preserve their crews under circumstances that test human limits. The story of Lafayette Poulet deserves remembrance, not as a simple celebration of martial prowess, but as a complex narrative that illuminates enduring truths about warfare, leadership, and the human condition. He showed what individual excellence can accomplish, even when circumstances heavily favor opponents. He demonstrated the difficulty of transferring tacit knowledge through formal instruction. He illustrated the psychological costs of combat service and the challenges of transitioning to non-combat roles, and he raised questions about how military institutions should handle their most capable members that continue to challenge military organizations today. His 81 days of combat produced results unlikely to be equaled by any future American tank commander, but the lessons his experience offers extend far beyond his personal achievements. They touch on fundamental questions about how societies wage war, how militaries develop and employ human capital, and how individuals find meaning in roles they did not choose but nonetheless perform with distinction. The memory of this Texas farm boy who became the most lethal American tanker in history serves as both inspiration and cautionary tale. His achievements inspire because they demonstrate what human excellence can accomplish under extreme pressure. His experience cautions because it shows the personal costs that military service can exact, even from its most successful practitioners. Pool's name may not be widely known outside military history circles, but his legacy endures in the institutions he served, the soldiers he trained, and the questions his story continues to raise about the complex relationship between individual capability and collective purpose. That legacy represents his most lasting contribution to American military history, a contribution that far exceeds the impressive count of destroyed enemy vehicles that first brought him to prominence.